And we are live. How's it going, guys? Welcome to another Symbolic Studies live stream. My name is Mario, in case this is your first time here. Tonight, we are going to be getting into solar symbolism, esoteric solar symbolism. And there's a lot to say about that because the sun is incredibly powerful, as you well know, and there's a lot of different angles with the sun that we could get into, but this presentation here is going to be pretty focused on two or three really specific ways of looking at solar symbolism and maybe what the deeper sort of decode is of solar symbolism. So before I get on and ramble about all of this stuff, just want to mention that you can find all of my wares and offerings at symbolicstudies.com. You can also find my links there, including Twitter and Instagram, things like that. Also, if you guys are interested in supporting the channel, you can do so at patreon.com/symbolicstudies. At the end of this presentation, by the way, I'm going to be announcing a new series that I'm starting next month for patrons only. So I have been wanting to do an exclusive Patreon offering or series of some sort, and nothing really to me made sense. This makes sense though, so I'm really excited to talk about that a bit later. But let's get into it here, and I'm just going to use this image here as kind of a placeholder while I talk about some of my introductory thoughts about solar symbolism. So the sun is really important and really significant for so many different reasons. And just like anything that's significant, or just like any symbol, really. So if we're talking about any planet or a constellation, if we're talking about an object or something like that, there are layers to it. And so I would say that my awareness of solar symbolism, especially over the last year or so, I would say has really grown quite a bit. And it's taken me in, I guess, directions I really wasn't expecting. And it's one of these things where I think the sun is such a big part of everybody's lives. And I feel as though it's so reliable, right? And it's so powerful. I think we can kind of, in some ways, take it for granted. And I think in some ways, we don't have an understanding largely about where a lot of solar symbolism comes from and where the solar tradition, a lot of the symbolic aspects of what I call the solar tradition or the solar age, which is the age we currently live in. I think a lot of those elements are kind of lost on us. And I think that the sun, a lot of times, is being given a sort of license to be known as the originator, I suppose, of everything, right? I even just saw someone say the other day, the sun is everything. So there's a lot of people out there that think that the sun is essentially the end all be all luminary in the heavens, right? And there's a lot to say about that. And we're going to be unpacking all of this throughout the presentation, right? But I'll say that I believe that a lot of solar symbolism actually comes from a previous tradition. And I think I have some good evidence here, some great quotes by some fantastic authors, and some visual evidence as well, and mythological evidence that suggests that the sun has an origin story, and the sun comes from at least the symbolism that we associate with the sun comes from a previous era, I guess you can say. And so I want to talk about that. And it seems as though to me, there was a time before solar worship. I'm just going to say it. The sun, for a lot of communities, is that supreme luminary. It's oftentimes compared to a center as well. So, as an example, my next slide, I have the solar system. Here we go. We're taught that the sun is the center of our system, and that all of the planets, the wandering stars, right, in the heavens revolve around the sun. And there you see Earth there, right, on that third ring. revolving around the sun. And so from a very early age, I've always been taught that the sun is the center, basically. And again, there's something to be said about that. Um, but what I want to talk about today is something that I kind of refer to and other authors have referred to as a symbolic transference, a symbolic transfer. And so, what I've kind of found over the years is that symbols change meaning over time. And so, if there is a symbol, some sign, or a constellation, things like that, it doesn't necessarily mean that the current meaning behind that sign, the current symbolic value behind that sign, is always what it's been associated with, or that it's always corresponded with that. And so, this idea of symbolic transfer is really, really interesting because I'm seeing that there was a large symbolic transfer from an earlier age, from a more primordial age, some people have referred to it that way, um, onto other symbols. And so a lot of symbols in today's world, when you look at a modern symbolic dictionary, they're only giving you that modern take of what the sun means, right? And we're going to be going over symbols that are heavily associated with the sun. And I'll show you that a lot of times this symbolism has other previous correspondences. To me, this is really fascinating and very, very interesting. And as you guys know, too, if you've been following my work at all, I've been following and studying the signs of astrology pretty heavily over the last handful of years. And so I have a reverence for the sun. All of the signs in astrology, right, they're along the ecliptic, which is the path of the sun. And so astrology is a solar-based system as well. But there were other systems before this, right? And so this image here, I don't personally believe it is what the universe or cosmos looks like. This is not my cosmology personally. And so I don't think everything revolves around the sun. And so, in fact, I think that Earth is more than likely center stage. And that's a lot of the material I've been getting into over the years as well. And so, what does that mean for solar symbolism? What does that mean for solar worship? If I don't think everything revolves around the sun, then I guess what is there? Or what can be kind of taken from that, right? Is there another system? And I'll say, yes, there is another system. There is a previous system before the age of solar worship. So here's just another illustration, right, of the sun, the central sun. And you'll see that the Earth is revolving around the sun. This is more of a modern sort of thing in my estimation. I'm way more interested in ancient cosmology and ancient cosmography, what the cosmos looked like to the ancients. I find that to be way more interesting and way more relevant. I am not a heliocentrist. I'm more of a geocentrist, and I'm open to other possibilities. But here you see the sun and the world or Earth around it, the spherical Earth going around the sun. And then you could see that there's an outer band, right? And this is the zodiac. So this is the path of the sun. So astrology, this 12 signs of astrology, although obviously there is the question or the idea of a 13th sign, Ophiuchus. I think Ophiuchus is very, very interesting. And actually, this past Ophiuchus season, I got into it more than usual. And there's a lot of fascinating things about Ophiuchus that I'll have to unpack at some point. I have talked about it on other shows, but I don't think I've published anything on my channel about Ophiuchus. But generally, people follow a 12-sign system, right? The number 12 is very, very solar. So that's something that I kind of want to just put out there. And it's going to be something that we return to later on in this presentation. 12, it has a solar correspondence generally. And you'll see this kind of, in our daily lives, right? So you see a clock, which we're going to talk about clock symbolism later on in the presentation. There's 12 numbers around a clock because we currently live in a solar paradigm. We live in a solar age. To me, I see the modern world as essentially being a solarized world. So I think that the sun essentially has kind of been overemphasized for a lot of reasons, right? And I'm not convinced that powerful families or groups of people are actually heliocentrists themselves. In a lot of ways, I think heliocentrism is meant for the masses, and I think it's for good reason. And so, but it's not for us. It's not to our benefit necessarily, right? So this solar paradigm, I think that some people might struggle with this. I'm sure a lot of people who already follow my stuff might know where I'm getting at, or will have no problem, with some of this information. I think a lot of New Agers too, in the New Age community, there's this overemphasis of the sun, right? In my opinion, and or what you can say is that there's an overemphasis of the physical sun, because as we're going to talk about, whenever you see a solar illustration, if you see a painting with the sun, right, or you read a poem and there's a reference to the sun, they're not always talking about, especially in the occult world, especially in the esoteric world, they're not always talking about the actual sun. They're talking about a metaphorical sun. This is allegory. They're talking about a spiritual sun, if you will. And so we're going to be getting into that too. So even when I look at this, or when I think about the previous slide, right, the solar system, is the sun the center of everything? Well, it kind of depends on what sun you're talking about. Are you talking about the physical sun that you see with your eyes? Or are you talking about a invisible sun? Are you talking about the spiritual sun or the philosopher's sun? Which sun are you talking about? So that's some of what we're going to be getting into today as well. So regarding the sun, though, as a central sort of concept, here Rene Guénon, which I've been going on about privately and on other channels, if you guys really want to take your symbolism to the next level, Rene Guénon is worth looking into. He is, I would say, in my estimation, one of the greatest symbologists in the modern world, because he has an understanding of the previous age that I'm referring to. He generally calls it the primordial tradition. I used to call it the northern or polar tradition. It goes by many, many names, but Rene Guénon has an understanding of this. And his book, Fundamental Symbols, sometimes it goes by Symbols of the Sacred Science, I believe. That's kind of the republished version of this book, is fantastic. In fact, it is kind of climbing up there with my most recommended book on symbolism. And what I found out is that a lot of symbologists after Guénon were really inspired by him. And so a lot of ideas that I really kind of gravitated towards, I later realized Guénon kind of helped popularize. But regarding the sun, he says, in the Vedic tradition, the sun is always at the center of the universe. This central and thus invariable position of the sun give it here the status of a veritable pole. That's just one clue. A pole. Polar symbolism being associated with the sun? Well, if it's in the center, kind of like a wheel, then it would make sense. It would make sense that the sun is something of an axle, right? The axle of the heavens, an axle of the cosmos, right? This is really interesting. We're going to continue to unpack this throughout this presentation, right? And so this sun, by the way, may not be the physical sun. This isn't necessarily talking about the sun that we see with our eyes. This is not the sun that rises from the east. This is a different kind of sun. So this will help you with your decoding. It's helped me with my decoding because now I understand it on a different level, right? But he says here that this central position basically makes it a pole. Very, very interesting. This immediately reminded me of the Fool card, right? So the first card in the Major Arcana, 0, just before the Magician card. Is this why the Fool in the Rider-Waite version has a pole, right, that carries his satchel or bag, And it looks like it's just an extension of the sun, in my opinion. It almost looks like a ray, actually. And I was really tempted to get into it here, this idea of ray symbolism and what that means. And also the seventh ray, which is a concept that people can look into if they're interested. Because actually, this pole, if you count the rays from the top down, line up with the seventh ray. There's this idea of a ray, that the seventh ray is this concept that basically is kind of transdimensional or interdimensional, transcendental, right? And so Ganon talks about this. A lot of others have talked about this as well. This idea of a seventh ray, but the fact that the seventh ray also extends into a pole, touches the tip of that pole, is very, very intriguing. I don't think that that's a mistake. I've already said too much because I decided to not really put that in this presentation because it would be too big of a tangent, really. But when I see that pole being aimed directly at the sun, it's talking about the polar influence of the sun, potentially the polar origins of the sun, right? And when you look at this card too, under sort of new eyes, I guess you can say, it's really interesting that the quote unquote northern aspect really comes very strongly. He looks like a northerner, right? Even just his appearance with that blonde hair. Look at those mountains in the background, right? The Fool, to me, what you can kind of get out of this artwork here is either I used to think that he was climbing a mountain, but now it's really clear to me that he's actually descending a mountain. So he's descending from the central mountain. He's descending from Mount Meru, if you want to call it that, or all of these other polar central mountains that exist in mythology. He is returning from a journey. He's returning from a trip. So they are actually making the connection, in my opinion, with a central polar mountain, which is one of the most ancient traditions that has ever existed, right? He's coming back from enlightenment, in my opinion. The mountain has long been thought of as a place of transition. And so whether you're climbing the mountain or you're entering the mountain through a cave, there's this idea that the mountain transforms, the mountain transmutes, right? So I have a copy of the Tibetan Book of the Dead. And what do they have on the cover? A central mountain, right? And so I'm sure a lot of people who probably are interested in this material, this is nothing new to you guys, right? This central mountain sort of concept, right? To me, he's returning from the central mountain, right? Post-enlightenment. This is why he's so light, by the way. This is why he's just appreciating, everything nature has to offer. This is why he is kind of basically etheric, and he's holding that rose, symbolic of kind of like stopping and smelling the roses, right? He's basking in the sun. So he doesn't have any worries or anything of that sort. And it's really interesting that this is even associated with the Fool card, because in actuality, tarot does this so much. It's so funny. He's a very wise man, right? There's a lot we can learn from the Fool, even though he's called the Fool. So the first sort of layer with this card, you would just think, oh, he's a foolish person. He doesn't make great decisions, or whatever the case might be. But in actuality, he has just returned from this enlightenment sort of experience on that central mountain. So he is actually not a fool at all, right? There's a lot to learn from his sort of journey and from where he's currently at, in life. So to me, I wanted to make this card like a quick thing, and here I am just kind of, going on tangents with it. But to me, there is a clear sort of relationship being made here with the sun, with the pole, and also with that mountain, that central mountain, right? I see the northern symbolism kind of coming out, and I'm inclined to think, really, that the tarot has a lot more northern polar symbolism that I have yet to even really decode. But we'll talk more about that as we continue. But let's look at some other solar symbols, right? Um, and see what we can kind of get out of decoding them. So here are three symbols that are commonly, in the modern world at least, associated with the sun. First, you have the circumpunct, right? The circled dot. And then you have the swastika. And then you have the quartered circle. And so all of these, if you look at most books on symbolism, they're probably going to reference the sun with all of them. And so the circumpunct, obviously, this is the symbol of the sun in astrology, right? But I've made the case that this is actually a polar symbol, that there's an aspect to it that precedes solar symbolism being attached to it. The swastika, people often call this a sun wheel, or that it's just symbolic of the sun in the heavens, right? I don't think that that's the case, personally. Same thing with the quartered circle. The quartered circle has often been called a sun wheel, and there are associations to be made there. So when people make these correspondences, they're not wrong, but it goes deeper than that. There's layers to this, right? And there's that symbolic transference that I've been talking about that I'm so intrigued with, right? So all three of these symbols, I would say, have a polar origin and were later associated with solar symbolism. So let's get into it. Right, so here is the circumpunct. So this is the Godhead. It's sometimes been referred to, and it's also very much emblematic of the monad. You know, we could do a whole presentation on just this symbol because it's so deep and it's so primordial. It's really ancient. And so all of these symbols have the center in common. And most symbols, I would say, especially, it's not always this way, but there's usually a central sort of component, a central point of pivot with these symbols. And so all three of them that I just showed have that, right? And so here you have the dot in the middle within the circle. Now, without getting too into the weeds here, I'll say that I see this not so much as a symbol of the sun, but I see this as a symbol of the heavens. So from the perspective of Earth, right, everything revolves around a central star, right? Excluding the wandering stars. The wandering stars have their own cycles and have their own pattern. But all of the other stars, all of the fixed stars in the heavens revolve around one point, and that is Polaris. That's the pole star, right? And so I see this sign as a polar glyph because, as I just said, it's primordial. The primordial tradition, the earliest symbolic tradition, what I've learned is actually polar and northern in nature, right? So there has been this huge transference, again, from polar to solar. So a lot of solar symbols in today's world were actually viewed as polar back in the day. Or when you really decode what they are aesthetically, visually, graphically, there's a polar sort of dynamic going on there. So the pole is a reference to the center, right? So again, just think of the axle of a wheel. And so that dot right there is emblematic of the pole. And the pole, one of its greatest associations is that it's a bridge between heaven and earth, which I've gone on about before, right? And there's so many symbols that reflect this. So whether we're talking about the column, the pillar, the post, the tree, the tower, the obelisk, it literally just goes on and on and on and on, right? That symbol, those symbols represent an immutable position. It doesn't change. It represents the changeless center. And all symbols that are emblematic of the center are basically, in so many ways, referencing the center of the cosmos, right? And as I've said before, too, in my opinion, the center of the cosmos the center of earth, and the center of self, they're all threaded together, metaphorically, symbolically. There's a relationship between the center of self, the center of who you are, right? And the center of earth and the center of the heavens. This is why it's been said that if you tap into that still point within, your changeless center, your immutable center, you're tapping into the universe itself. You're tapping into the cosmos. Know thyself and you'll know the universe. It's absolutely true, right? Because of this relationship, because of this golden thread or this golden cord that connects everything together, right? And so I see this dot as the pole. The dot, generally, when you're looking at the circumpunct, is viewed as being very masculine, and then the circle around it is viewed as being very feminine. So it's almost like the womb holding the child, right? Holding the sun. It's really interesting that this relationship exists, and the sun is called the sun, right? I think that's a fascinating sort of correspondence or relationship. And so, in sort of occult terms, the dot in the middle can be considered Hadit, and then the circle around could be considered Nuit, right? But if you look at this photo here, right, this time-lapse photo of the northern sky, you'll see what I'm talking about. You'll see this changeless center that is the pole star, by the way, right? The northern star, and you will see that there's this streak of stars going around it. This is the perspective that we have from Earth, right? And I'm under the opinion that I'm always going to remain on Earth, and I'm not going to see Earth from an outside perspective, right? And so no matter how much media we're fed otherwise, that's my opinion. I trust my senses, and I see it that the heavens are revolving around us, not the other way around. That's a big distinction here with the ancient world, ancient cosmology, and modern cosmology. Because what we're also talking about here with the polar to solar transfer or the polar to solar flip is the transition from geocentrism, an earth-based perspective and a reverence for the earth, amongst a lot of other things, but generally this earth-based sort of reverence, to a sun-based reverence. So geocentrism to heliocentrism, that's a big part of this conversation that we're getting into right now, essentially. So if the earth is stationary and the heavens revolve around it, this is what you're going to see. So when I see the circumpunct, I see the I see the polar symbolism very, very strongly. I understand that a lot of things got transferred over to a solar perspective, but this is more of a modern idea. And there's a number of authors, guys. This is the thing that blows my mind. There's a number of authors that have written about this, right? So not just the authors that I'm going to be talking about today. So there's three main authors I'll be talking about today. But there's more. There's way more, right? And so once you have this idea kind of locked in, you start seeing mythology in a different way. You start seeing symbolism in a different way. It's the gift that keeps on giving because this information is primordial. This information really, really breaks a lot of things down that maybe would have been confusing otherwise. It really, really is helpful in symbolic decoding, and I think it's little known or understood. And I'm so passionate about it that I'm going to read about it regardless, but I needed to get some of this stuff off my chest, right? So when you just think about the sun and then you think about this dynamic here, you know, the circumpunct, what makes more sense, right? That's the symbol of the sun, or it's a symbol of the northern sky, right? And everything revolving around this axis, right? This world axis. So that dot is symbolic of the world axis. And this was a sort of primary idea in ancient cosmology, and it's really never left, right? Because when you look at all of the symbolism in the world, whether it's the wheel or the swastika, as we're talking about, or the column or whatever, when you decode it from a polar perspective and from a world axis perspective, its true esoteric original nature or essence really comes to light, right? When everything's just attributed to the sun, I feel like there's something that's left to be desired. That's just me personally. So once I started finding out that this is a genuine, authentic sort of angle for symbolic decoding, I was all in. And as I continue to read about it and as I continue to understand it, it's more holistic. That's the other aspect here. Geocentrism is way more holistic than heliocentrism symbolically. So attributing everything to the sun, to me, isn't very holistic because it's not the whole truth. Because solar symbolism, in large part, came from an earlier era. And hopefully by the end of this presentation, you'll see what I'm talking about. So moving on to the swastika. The swastika is another example where a lot of people associate the swastika with solar symbolism and that somehow it's related to the movement of the sun or the power of the sun. And I don't personally see it that way. A lot of other people don't see it that way either. That might be a new correspondence for it, but that's not its primary original correspondence. Notice that there is that cross in the middle, right? When you look at cross symbolism and you start decoding cross symbolism, that middle point represents the sort of fifth point. So if you're looking at a cross, obviously the cross has a lot to do with the number 4. There's 4 quadrants. There's 4 arms emanating from the middle. That middle point, though, would be the fifth point or the fifth way. And it represents the point of transcendence. It represents the point that connects the above and the below, which is what the world axis represents. And I'm of the opinion that the swastika, as I've said before, is really an expression of Ursa Major, a northern constellation going around the pole star. It makes all the sense in the world, in my opinion. And a lot of other cultures and people have made this connection. And it makes way more sense than it being a solar exclusive symbol. And I was actually happy to see that Rene Guénon has talked about this, right? Not only swastika symbolism, the world axis symbolism, but also this idea that in the modern world, it generally is associated with the sun, and that's not entirely accurate. So here he says, the swastika is essentially the sign of the pole. That pole would be the middle point that revolves, right? Or that everything revolves around. The swastika is essentially the sign of the pole. It would seem that in modern Europe, its true significance has never been made known. Most often, it is made out to be a solar sign, which it could only have become accidentally and in a rather indirect way. So he agrees. He's saying that it is not a solar sign, that it actually is more polar. He doesn't say that. I guess he does say it's the sign of the pole. He goes on further outside of this quote. But he believes it to be a polar northern expression, an expression of the supreme center. And so the idea is that the North Pole connects the above and the below in that it is along the path of the world axis, which the North Star is also along this path, right? But that this path or this pole, this world axis or the axis mundi, it's emblematic of another destination, or it's emblematic of a supreme center that is even beyond the north, believe it or not. And so I'll be sharing some stuff later on in this presentation that gets into the symbolism more heavily, but that this center is the bridge between spheres of reality. It's the bridge between different layers of reality, right? And so one of the things that he even mentions that I think is beautiful, perhaps I talked about this recently somewhere, but the idea of a necklace with beads on it, right? That simple cord that's beaded, that cord represents the cord that connects the above and the below. And these beads symbolically represent the different spheres of reality, the different spheres of existence, right? However you want to look at it. But that thread, this golden cord, is what connects the above and the below. And I've gotten into this too in other presentations. I'm thinking right now of the magician's wand. I talk about the magician's wand and how the number one is also a polar symbol. What does it look like? It just looks like a pole, right? The idea of oneness is more of a polar concept. It's not so much a solar concept, although that transference occurred, right? And so the number one being the magician card, the number one also looking like a wand, right? He holds the wand above in one hand, and then with his other hand, he's pointing down to the ground. And so, in my estimation, what he's saying is, I connect the above and the below, and I separate the above and the below. I am the bridge between heaven and earth, essentially. I am the pole, basically. And we are P-pole. And our spine is symbolic of the pole as well, as are other things as well, right? But just wanted to kind of throw that out there. So the magician, that card and its association with Mercury as well. This is polar symbolism, in my opinion. In fact, also related to this, a lot of deities or a lot of gods that are considered solar in nature, which we'll be talking about, were once polar in nature. When you look at their sort of original influence, it was polar. And then at a later time in history, they became more solarized. So the idea of a polar deity is kind of lost to the sands of time, right? I would say. And Mercury, Hermes, Thoth, right? I think that this is a polar deity. There are other polar deities out there. And so that's something that I'm trying to kind of revive and get out there as well, is this concept of a polar deity, because obviously most people do not talk about that. So here's the quartered circle, right? A cross within a circle. Very powerful symbol. The material I first read when I was getting into this symbol was saying that it was a earth sign, a sign for earth. And I think that makes a lot of sense, right? For a lot of different reasons, actually. And I was surprised to see, though, that a lot of subsequent resources that I got into would refer to it as a solar sign, that it's just a symbol for the sun. And so that kind of threw me off for a while until I found out about the polar to solar transfer. So the older expression of this symbol was more geocentric. It was more earth-based, right? The number 4, by the way, has a lot to do with earth symbolism. So the number 4, right? It's not uncommon for people to talk about the 4 corners of earth or the 4 quarters of earth, right? My understanding is that a lot of ancient peoples, what they did was they would have a central totem in their village or town. And from that central totem, whatever it might be, I'm thinking of a standing stone, I'm thinking of a tree, right? Emblematic of the world tree. From there, they would divide their village, or they would divide their region into 4 different parts, 4 quarters. And it wasn't uncommon for there to be 4 roads that basically expanded from there. So a northern road, a north-south road, and then an east-west road. So that central point, right, represents the crossroads. And so this gets into all sorts of mercurial symbolism and hermetic symbolism, in my opinion. But once again, that cross, that middle point, is the point of transcendence. It's the point where, I almost imagine a stairway, or I almost imagine a ladder or a tower being right there in the middle, right? So this represents the 3D axis, basically. So I believe it would be the x-axis and y-axis, and then the z-axis, right? The third dimension is kind of being implied with that central dot, with that central point, that the cross in the middle, where those 2 arms, where those 2 lines intersect. That would be the point of transcendence, in my opinion. So this gets into what I've been saying basically about that fifth point, or that the fifth way. It's also symbolic of the middle way, pretty much, right? And so to me, when I see this symbol, when I see this glyph, I see earth symbolism all over. And this is very geocentric as well, right? But later on, it got transferred over to being more solar in nature, right? And so this X, or this cross, by the way, very much related to X symbolism, right? So like X marks the spot, right? All you have to do is just rotate it. And so the cross and the X, pretty much synonymous, in my opinion, in so many different ways, right? Which I think is pretty obvious. That middle point as well, if this is a geocentric symbol, that middle point represents north, right? It represents the sacred center in the middle of this land. And regarding that, Ganon has to say, so in regards to the Holy Land or sacred center, he says, it is in fact the terrestrial paradise, which is indeed the point of departure, right, for every tradition, having in its center the one wellspring from which flow the four rivers towards the four cardinal points. I'm sure most people who are watching this are probably familiar with some of this symbolism, but this is an ancient concept, that this terrestrial paradise, this holy land, has these four paths or rivers or winds even emanating from the center, basically, right? And so this reminds me very much of this older Mercator map, right? It shows that central mountain. Then it has the rivers going north, south, east, and west. Although me saying north, right? North is really in the middle. So, but there's an expression of four different ways coming out of that central mountain, right? That is basically what you're seeing with these quartered circle, in my estimation. It also relates to astrology, because what we're kind of seeing here, you can make the argument that what we're seeing are it's the fixed cross, right? Potentially with the fixed signs being at the end of this cross. The zodiac wheel being made up of 12 signs. There's actually 3 different crosses. So there's the cardinal cross, the fixed cross, and then also the mutable cross, right? But really anything at the end of the day, anything circular, or anything for that matter, can be divided up into quarters, pretty much, right? And so whether you're dividing your town into quarters or your region into quarters, this central place, by the way, this holy land or the terrestrial paradise that Ganon talks about, this northern location, this polar Arctic location, I mean, this is one of the things that I just geek out on, is this idea of an Arctic origin, but then also an Arctic return, or a northern return, a northern origin and a northern return, right? This central holy land or paradise, and this might all just be metaphorical, so I'm open to the idea that a lot of my northern polar symbolism, it's just a representation of this allegorical center, right? And maybe we just use the north as this center, or that's kind of been the deep decode of a lot of myths. But this center, this holy land, where I believe is where Eden, the expression of Eden, I believe is a northern expression, right? This central location. To me, it makes a lot of sense that when people have a holy site, a holy land, it's an expression of this original homeland, basically. Unbeknownst to most of them, I would say, right? And so whether it be Jerusalem, whether it be Mecca, or whether it be other places, it's what Ganon refers to as a secondary location or a secondary principle of the center. It's not the original center, but it's emblematic or a representation of that center. And I believe this is actually a very healthy thing, to have a place to call your own, to have a place that you want to defend and fight for, a place that you believe your people come from. This is very, very healthy. And a lot of people, have a lot of different opinions about the origin of where they come from, right? We're going to be getting into some northern symbolism that a lot of Christians are talking about right now, who are interested in what's called the millennial reign or the millennial kingdom. They believe that the millennial kingdom is actually located at the north. A lot of people, I've been pleasantly surprised to come across a lot of videos of people talking about this. But there's a strong northern correspondence that's coming out in some Christian communities about it being where essentially Christ is, where his sort of celestial Jerusalem or where his new kingdom is located, that there's a northern aspect to it, whether it be in the northern sky or the northern portion of Earth. It's very, very fascinating. I've been digging, just getting into it, and I've come across multiple now at this point, multiple communities from different faiths that have a very strong northern polar correspondence. And I just think it's really interesting. So the quartered circle, I see that as a northern sort of symbol. And I would say too, even the cross itself, right? The Latin cross here, where the arm is a little bit higher up on that vertical pole. I've said this before in multiple live streams at this point, but what predates the cross? The vertical pole. That predates the cross. The arm came later, but the vertical pole, a polar symbol, right, predates this Latin cross here with that horizontal arm, right? It's really interesting. I'm going to show you images here in just a bit of polar symbolism related to Christ, actually. But I just wanted to bring that up briefly. So the vertical standing stone predating, the cross there. Very, very intriguing. So regarding polar and solar symbolism, Ganon says, it goes without saying that these two symbolisms, polar and solar, must never be confused, and that as we have often indicated, polar symbolism is far more fundamental and in fact truly primordial. And so here, one of the greatest, if not the greatest, symbolic minds in the modern world is also expressing the fact that polar symbolism is the primordial symbolic framework, not solar symbolism. And so he's one of the guys that really gets it, which is why I feel like I am calling him one of the greatest symbologists, because he understands. And a lot of the information that I've been chewing on over the last handful of years regarding polar and solar stuff, unbeknownst to me, a lot of it goes back to Ganon. But there are other sources pre-Ganon who talks about this symbolism very, very directly. I've mentioned his name before, but there was a fellow named John O'Neill, and he has a whole chapter in his book called Polar versus Solar Worship, and he really gets into this as well. He talks about the transference. There's so many angles with this, as you can imagine, because solar symbolism is absolutely huge. Polar symbolism is absolutely huge. You cannot unpack this in just one book. You cannot unpack this in just one presentation. This is just my sort of best effort to talk about solar symbolism and how it has a primordial origin, which is more northern, basically. But when you look into mythology, I've been surprised with this information in mind. I've been surprised to see the polar sort of correspondence with certain myths, which we'll be getting into right now. Hey guys, I hope you're enjoying the presentation. Before we continue, I'd like to talk about my new series called Symbolic Secrets. I just released the 6th episode on the Hierophant card, where I cover my latest research about the card and dive deep into its esoteric symbolism. New episodes come out every other week. If you want to learn about the symbolic secrets of the tarot, now is the perfect time to sign up. At the moment, there's 2 ways to watch this series. Both options are by subscription for $5 a month. You can join my Patreon at patreon.com/symbolicstudies or subscribe through my site, symbolicstudies.com. This is also the perfect way to support the channel if you find value in my work. Back to the presentation. So I'm going to talk about a few of these, and I'm really going to unpack the Jesus Christ polar aspect. But the first son of the Aztecs. So my understanding is that the Aztecs they refer to their sort of great ages or cycles as suns. So there was the first sun, second sun, third sun, etc. And I believe there's 5 total suns or great cycles. But the first sun, I was surprised to see, but maybe I shouldn't be at this point, that their first sun actually corresponds with the north. And so all of the suns have a directional correspondence. And I don't know if this is an across the board thing that everyone sees it this way, but one of my resources mentioned that when I was looking into solar symbolism, and I thought, oh, well, that's pretty curious. The first sun coming from the north, that kind of makes sense. That makes sense with everything that I've come to learn about this polar to solar transfer, right? So that's just one quick example. I'm not going to unpack this too much further. Same thing with Apollo, who's sometimes known as Hyperborean Apollo, right? It's interesting that Apollo, who most people, most modern people, they look at Apollo and they see a lot of solar symbolism with Apollo, right? He's associated with the light, amongst other things. But I think it's fascinating that he goes to Hyperborea and he's revered by the Hyperboreans. And so Hyperborea means beyond the north wind, right? And so this northern sort of idea is even attached to Apollo, who's a known solar deity to most people, right? I think there's with every single deity, there's layers, just like what I'm saying with the sun. But that is one of Apollo's primary correspondences is with the sun. And so he actually goes to Hyperborea in the winter, which is really interesting because the solstices all have a directional correspondence. Ganon is really adamant that the winter solstice corresponds with the north. Isn't that interesting? Where does Santa come from? He comes from the North Pole, right? And so also, I mean, there's a lot of things to be said about the solstices and the equinoxes and things of that sort. But I'm just going to leave it at that, actually, before I open up a whole can of worms. But Apollo has a Hyperborean northern aspect when you look into his mythology. So the sun god going to the north is this symbolic of the, Tropic of Capricorn, right? Versus the Tropic of Cancer. There's a lot of things to be discussed here, but I thought that that was really interesting that the Hyperboreans, this place beyond the north wind, has a reverence for Apollo, the sun god, and this is where he goes, during winter. Very, very interesting. Also, you've got Jesus Christ, right? So what I've been saying is that, in my opinion, I see Jesus as being more of a mercurial figure that was later made to be more solar in nature. So his sun-like qualities, from what I gather, that is more of a modern sort of take, or at least, who knows what year we live in, right? And I'm not even saying that Christ was a real person. I'm saying that it seems to me like this same transference of what I'm referring to, polar to solar, also applies to Christ, basically. And so he's more mercurial in nature, and I view Mercury as being a polar deity. So Mercury is a psychopomp. He's a guide of souls. Very interesting. Christ was like a good shepherd, right? And his flock followed him. And so there's a lot of mercurial symbolism with Jesus. Even the fact that he's associated with so many different things, it's absolutely amazing. There's so many nicknames. I remember I looked it up one time. I'm like, what are all of the nicknames for Jesus? And I was like blown away how many there were, right? So the branch, right? The Lamb of God, the Line of Judah, a solar sort of idea, right? And it just goes on and on and on the way, so there's so many different ones. And so to me, this is very mercurial in nature, right? So when someone is mercurial, they are able to, be one way 1 minute and a different way the next minute, right? They're able to kind of change faces or be malleable and be flexible. So I see Jesus as being kind of like that figure. So this mercurial aspect, I think, is very, very strong, right? But there's polar symbolism that I see associated with him as well, and I would say as too, and I have to give Ganon credit once again because he's just blowing my mind over here. I'm not through it all of the way, but there's this book that I'm working through right now, and it's called The King of the World. Sometimes the older translation is The Lord of the World, right, by Rene Ganon. Pretty small book, but what he's basically getting at in this material is that the king of the world, or rather king symbolism, lord symbolism, goes back to a northern polar king, that their kingdom is in the north, that their kingdom is oftentimes mythologically in ancient texts associated with a hidden kingdom at the north, right? And so I wasn't even expecting him to get into some of this material in that book. I didn't know what he was going to get into, but I saw him referencing that book in particular in Fundamental Symbols. So I picked it up. I started reading it. I'm like, whoa. So he's saying king, lord symbolism is a northern sort of thing, that it derives from northern concepts, and that in today's world, it's become solarized. What do you know? It's exactly like what I've been talking about up until this point. It's exactly what he talks about in some of his other works as well. So that's something to keep in mind, right? And he's just so good. But here, let's look at this image here, right? This is supposedly the third figure on the left. So the first, second, third figure, right, from the left. You see that he has a wand. This is Christ, right? You see that he has a wand here. And I believe what he's doing is he's raising people from the dead. He's reviving the dead, essentially. He's performing a miracle, basically, right? There are a lot of Jesus Christ images, statues, illustrations that are pretty ancient, pretty old, that show Christ as more of a magician, that shows him as more of a wizard, right? Performing these types of feats. And so this is something that has been scrubbed, I think, right? I don't know, I can't give you a timeline, but at some point, this kind of imagery was scrubbed. And instead, what became more favorable was to emphasize his solar nature, to emphasize the solar aspects. And so now in today's world, many people just associate him with the sun. But there is a primordial northern polar sort of origin, I would say. And the wand, just like what I was talking about with the magician card, the wand is one of these symbols that is the world axis. That's what it is. That's what the number 1 is as well. That's what is being shown here. That's what the wand is. It bridges the gap between above and below. And so this is just one image, right, that you can look at that shows Christ as being more of a magician. So that wand is a polar symbol in my estimation. There's also an aspect of Christ's story where he is getting, I believe it's called the scourging of Christ, right? Where he's essentially beaten against a pole, right? Against a column. And so this was based on my research, that this was how it was done, is that people were tied to poles and pillars and columns. I believe in my Axis of Libra presentations, I get into this a little bit. They're called pillories, right? And so here he is tied to a pole and he is beaten. Kind of interesting. I'm just throwing this out there. I don't think that this is like a smoking gun sort of thing, but I just think it's very interesting that this imagery even exists of him being tied to a pole, because he's so obviously connected to the cross itself. Here you see another example. Christ tied to a column or a pillar, right? The column or pillar, it's one of the strongest associations we have to the world axis. And ancient peoples understood this basically, right? So once again, it's like the axle of a great wheel, the great wheel of heaven, in my opinion. But the pole symbolism doesn't stop there because there are people out there, and I'll say, just to be pretty explicit and transparent with this mostly comes from the Jehovah's Witnesses. And so they have this understanding that Christ wasn't staked to a cross, right? But he was staked to a pole, basically a post, right? And so I think that that is fascinating. One of my actually someone I'm collaborating with design work, shout out Mike, he made me aware of this. And he was like, "Hey, have you ever heard of this before?" He goes, "I remember hearing about this when I was a kid, and I thought you should know that some people think he was nailed to a stake, rather, and not a cross, right? So this is more of a primordial sort of correspondence." And here's another image of this as well. So instead of them being crucified, right? Instead of them being staked to a cross or nailed to a cross, they are on poles. Isn't that interesting? I think this is fascinating for so many different reasons, right? And it just makes me wonder, it's like, is there, I'm inclined to think that this is all mythology, but is this an older understanding, right? Does this predate the cross? I don't really know. Maybe some of you guys out there know. If you have any information about this, let me know, because I want to follow this thread actually, because I think it's intriguing. But as I said earlier, there's a whole group of people online right now that are really interested in this idea of a millennial reign or a millennial kingdom. The basic idea is that these people believe that there's a possibility that Christ has returned already. He reigned for 1,000 years. And what we're living in right now is what's referred to as a little season where Satan, rules over the world before Christ's eternal reign and God's eternal reign. I believe I have that right. But it's really interesting because what a lot of these people are saying, like what I mentioned earlier, is that the North plays a significant key. And the North is where I also believe, is the location of the real stairway to heaven, right? From Earth to the heavens, from the anywhere on Earth, really, to the pole star, basically. I think when you see Jacob's ladder, I believe when you see any stairway that's ascending to the heavens, they're actually implying this northern sort of correspondence, right? And this idea of some people have referred to this as like a hyperspace kingdom, this idea of a celestial Jerusalem or a celestial kingdom of some kind, right? That there's a northern aspect going on there that some people see, right? Whether it be, again, literally in the heavens or somewhere in the north. I know people have also talked about the camp of saints, Jesus's camp of saints being at the north, these really ascended people being in a camp over there. And so this is something that, this is not the core of this presentation by any means, but I just wanted to mention it because it's something new that I've been looking into. And I would say a decent channel to look into this would be Understanding Conspiracy, I believe is the channel. He's all about it now. And the northern stuff to me is just the most intriguing aspect of it. So maybe if it's possible, I will, try and interview him or something along these lines. But I think that's interesting. You can't get away from this angle here, in my opinion. So the North playing a part, and then the fleur-de-lis, which I've gotten into in other streams, being related to Mary, right, and virgin birth and all this other stuff. The fleur-de-lis, usually on older compasses and compass roses, indicates north. Why? Also, why does the compass point north? There is a physical aspect here, but then there's also a metaphysical aspect, I would say. All you have to do is follow your compass, because following or finding, trying to locate the true north or understanding the concept of the true north externally, I think kind of has this, there's an internal relationship of finding your true north or vice versa, right? But this true north sort of idea, I don't think you have to go north. That's actually one of the funny things is some of these people are trying to campaign and actually go to the North Pole. And they're not the first ones in modern times that have tried to do this. I actually met a guy and he wanted to gather some of his research friends and actually go to the North Pole because they had, sort of a reverence for some of this stuff and ancient cosmology and everything else. Me personally, I don't think you have to do that. I think you go north by going within, basically. I think that that's sort of the correspondence there. So I don't think you have to physically go there personally, but that's just where I'm at. So as you can see, what I'm essentially talking about here is this polar to solar transfer, this polar to solar switch, right? As I've mentioned a handful of times. And so that is where I believe a lot of solar symbolism comes from, is from the central pole that connects everything. This is the world axis, right? And so I mentioned this earlier, but when people refer to the sun, they're not always referencing the physical sun that rises in the east. And there's also a tradition making reference to other suns, but they're making it known that they're not referencing that sun. Sometimes you'll see it be referred to as a spiritual sun, a black sun, the philosopher's sun, the midnight sun, the invisible sun, the central sun, or even the secret sun. I'm inclined to think that all of these references are to the center, the supreme center, basically. So if we live, I'm also inclined to think that we live in a large toroidal structure of some kind, right? And so the middle portion of the torus field, I believe it's called the hyperbola, right, is what connects everything together. That is the center to the cosmos, right? So this is the sacred center or the supreme center. Ganon often refers to it, I believe, as the supreme principle, right? And so this spiritual sun, black sun, philosopher's sun, all these things, it's not the sun that we see with our eyes. It is a central location in the cosmos, right? That connects all of the realms together. That's my opinion. So the sun has really been used as a symbol for the center, right? This is why, to me, when I think about it, and I think about it from a more earth-based perspective. So think about it from your perspective, not from diagrams, that the school system has shown you, and not from movies or anything like that, from your own human perspective, your own eyes, right? The sun rises in the east and then goes across the sky and sets in the west, right? And then half of the day or thereabouts, you don't see the sun. So to me, it's interesting that we have so much central sort of symbolism that people bestow upon the sun, even people saying that you go through the sun upon death. But the center is immovable. The center is immutable. The center is changeless. The true center is changeless, right? The sun, to me, I think about that, and I'm just going to look actually east here. So I look east, and then my head just goes around, and then it goes west. And then the next day, the sun is in the east, and then it goes over the sky and then goes west, right? Over and over and over and over. And if I follow the sun, I'm just going to be going around in circles, right? Eastward, up in the sky, down west, down below. Now I have to turn around, and then the sun comes back up, right? And so this is a lot of mythology that people say, is that the sun dies every night, right? And then it's reborn, or that there's this rebirth every single morning. And so to me, that is symbolically, to me, that's like a potentially poor excuse for a center, because I have to constantly be moving around like this. My head has to be on a swivel in order to look at the center, because we've been taught that Earth is a spinning ball and we revolve around it, and there's all these different movements and cycles, right, that we're subjected to. Now, you look at the pole star. I'm looking north right now. The pole star is there right now. It'll be there tomorrow, and the day after, and the day after, and the day after. Throughout my whole entire life, the pole star, the North Star, never changes its location. Everything revolves around it. From the perspective of Earth, once you know where the pole star is, and you know where it's at forever, basically, unless you move around, unless you're the one who's traveling and everything else. So I think, to me, the spiritual sun, black sun, all of these different ideas, they're talking about a stationary sun, basically. That's why there's a metaphor for it. So the black sun, I believe, is a reference to the stationary sun at the middle of the universe, right? And so, which is along the line of the world axis, basically. So hopefully that makes sense. I think that these different names here, these different labels, aren't referring to the sun that goes around and around and around. It's actually referring to an immobile sun, a stationary sun, basically. So Ganon has a lot of brilliant things to say about the sun and its relationship to the being the heart of the world, right? Which is another label that the sun has been given. And he says it right here. Needless to say, this does not concern the sun that all men see, but rather the spiritual sun that few men know by the intellect. So that should be few men right there. But rather, the spiritual sun is the sun that few men know by the intellect. Very interesting. He's just saying it plainly and explicitly. That is not the sun that is being referred to when we refer to the sun as being the heart of the world or the center of everything. In my opinion, that's what I'm gathering with everything. All right. So another author, Henry Corbin, says, and this is an excellent book, The Man of Light in Iranian Sufism. I've been really surprised to see, guys, that esoteric Islam has a lot of juicy, interesting, important polar symbolism baked into it. I've been blown away. And so I've used this quote before, but I believe just a shorter version, but let's read the whole thing. So this is in reference to the Orient, right? So we're talking about, the East, basically, which is where the sun rises from, the rising sun. So in reference to the Orient, he makes a great connection. And he says this suprasensory mystical Orient, the place of the origin and of the return, as I've been saying with the sacred center or supreme center, object of the eternal quest, right? That this is the point of everything, is to tap into this center, is at the heavenly pole. It is the pole at the extreme north, so far off that it is the threshold of the dimension beyond. So the Orient sought by the mystic, the Orient that cannot be located on our maps. If it was just a reference to the East, we would have it located on a map. We can point to it, right? The Orient that cannot be located on our maps is in the direction of the north, beyond the north. Only an ascensional progress can lead towards this cosmic north, chosen as a point of orientation. So he goes on, he opens his whole entire book about this, about how the word orient or oriental comes from orientation, that these ideas are completely related to each other. When you get into, I guess, material related to secret societies, especially like Freemasonry and things, you'll know that a lot is made about the East. And a lot of supposed information, secrets, right? Occult secrets come from the East. What he's saying is that this East is not literally East. It's actually North. It's a metaphor for the North. So to me, that's really interesting. So even this morning, I went outside. I saw the sun rising over the eastern horizon. And when I looked at it, I had this idea of, it finally kind of clicked and occurred to me that the rising sun in the East is a metaphor for the supreme sacred center, basically the world axis. That transference actually does make sense in a lot of ways, because the sun is so brilliant, right? And it gives humanity so much, right? That became kind of clear to me just this morning when I saw it rising over the eastern horizon. I'm like, gotcha. I think I understand all of this now. It's starting to make a lot more sense, right? So only something as brilliant as the sun um, is suitable to actually be a reference to this cosmic north, right? And so in this book, he also says that the world axis gives us orientation because there's an upward ascension. That because the world axis is what it is, and Ganon talks about this, that the world axis moves its way upward. That energy goes upward. And then once it goes so far up, it actually cycles back to itself, just like a torus field. So, with the world axis in mind, you can have orientation here. That it's only by the north and the North Star, which is a traditional star to orient yourself. If you're sailing the seven seas, that the North Star, because it's along the line of the world axis, it's what allows us to have some sort of orientation here. That you can't have orientation without the North, essentially, right? And so I think that's fascinating. And the Orient being a metaphor for this cosmic North, or for the North. So here is a Freemasonic illustration. I think it's really interesting. This is from a French lodge system, if I'm not mistaken. And right there in the upper triangle, they have the word Orient. With this new understanding, it makes a lot more sense. This is a northern polar reference, right? So this isn't the east. This is beyond that. It's even beyond the north, according to Corbin, right? And notice that it's right there in the middle. So I've long said that the middle pillar is the northern pillar. It's even referenced with the hidden Sephiroth, Doth being a northern Sephiroth, right? Which is acknowledged, in an open sort of way. And that this Sephiroth really is just symbolic of the world axis, in my opinion. That's what I pick up from it. So the word Orient, very, very interesting. So speaking of the East, though, there's a thread that I want to kind of pull at a little bit here in this presentation. And I got this from a book called Galactic Alignment by John Major Jenkins. I haven't read it from cover to cover, but I did look through it and skim through it for polar symbolism because he acknowledges it. And it doesn't seem like he's a geocentrist either. He's a heliocentrist. And so, but he understands that there was a great polar to solar transfer. And that's why I bought this book. Any author, I've said this before, any author that's making reference to the polar tradition or northern tradition, I'm interested in reading their material. He's one of these guys. He makes reference to it. He understands that this is a part of real history and real symbolism and all this other type of stuff. But in this book, he said something amazing that I had never read before. He says that according to him, and I'm not someone that, likes to throw out concrete dates. This happened 500 years ago. This happens 2,000 years ago. Things like that, because I don't know what timeline we're really in. I think history and the timing of everything has been messed with so heavily. I can't confidently kind of claim these sorts of things personally. If that's where you're at, go for it. But that's not where I'm at personally. But in this book, he says essentially, and it was too much to quote, so I'm just going to recall it and kind of summarize it for you all. Essentially, what he says is that in ancient China, around 5,000 years ago, he said right around the time of the I Ching, which is, one of their divination systems made up of the 64 hexagrams, which is comprised of 8 trigrams, right? He says that they had an understanding that their zodiac was actually in the northern sky, and that they had 8 constellations around the pole star, around the North Star, and each of these constellations was a reference to a different trigram. And so I'm not going to get into the I Ching system here, really, not that deep at least, but you'll know that the trigrams are made up of yin and yang, basically yin and yang lines, 3 lines that are either yin or yang. And so he says that they had 8 constellations in the northern sky, that this was their sky clock, that this was their zodiac, basically. He said until we started transferring over to a solar-based system. until people started transferring over to towards a heliocentric model. Then he said what happened was these 8 constellations that represented the 8 trigrams in the heavens around the pole star got transferred over to the ecliptic, which is the path of the sun, and then they added 4 more constellations, giving them 12 signs. 12 signs of the zodiac around the path of the sun. So he's saying that their 12 based system of astrology is northern in origin. That just blew my mind. I could not believe that. And so, I have more follow-up research to do about this specific claim, but I guess at the moment I have no reason to doubt that he's probably correct with all of this. Maybe some of the timeline stuff is a little bit askew or what have you, but it matches everything that I'm trying to say here, is that there is this great transference from a polar understanding to a solar understanding. So these 12 signs, according to him, originally it was 8 signs, 1 per trigram in the northern sky. And so if you've never seen these trigrams before, there they are, right? And so the unbroken line is yang. The broken line with the gap in the middle is yin. And so they had 1 constellation per trigram here. I think it's also interesting that they have the yin yang symbol, right? Right there in the middle, right? It's this perpetual motion. When I see anything that's revolving, whether it's the swastika, whether it's the wheel, right? Which is a very Eastern sort of symbol, right? It's the revolution of heaven, and the revolution of heaven, the revolving of heaven, the churning of heaven happens around one point, and it's the pole star. It's the North Star. So I see that there is polar symbolism, in the yin yang as well. Personally, that's how I take it. But I thought this claim was absolutely amazing. And here you can see even almost the kind of, I guess, sort of unification of these ideas, right? So the octagon on the right-hand side with the trigrams, the 8 trigrams, the yin-yang in the middle, and then you have the octagon. This is the just reverse side of this on the left-hand side, but then you see also the 12 signs of the zodiac. Very interesting. One side is numerologically very much related to the 8. The other side is also related to the 8 because of the frame itself, but also has this 12 correspondence because of the 12 signs. Very, very interesting. Also, Ganon makes not the exact same claim because he wasn't talking about ancient China, but he makes the same claim in that he says that the signs of the zodiac were once polar and then got transferred over to the ecliptic as well. So this is a thread that I'm going to continue pulling at because I want to know more information about this. And to me, it makes all of the sense in the world. Based on my research, I really feel as though the original sky clock is Ursa Major going around the pole star. That was the original sky clock. It's so simple. It's so basic. And then at a certain point with probably the spread or whatever of heliocentrism, then our sky clock changed and then became a 12 sign sort of system. And then we're now hyper focused, I would say, probably on the path of the sun. But I think that whether you're talking about the Western zodiac or the Eastern zodiac, I think its origins are polar, guys. So that's why I included these slides. All right. So regarding clocks and sky clocks, let's just kind of unpack some of this symbolism here and see what we can learn from just looking at a normal clock, right? I mean, we all grew up with these things. And so you have a clock with 12 numbers on it. I said earlier that 12 is very much a solar-based number. Ganon actually says that 12 is, when you really, really go back to its origins, that it's very polar in nature, right? And this is some of what he's getting into with his Lord of the World book. But I see it, at least right now, I see the solar aspects of it, right? So Christ having 12 disciples, the 12 signs of the zodiac, and then we have 24-hour days, essentially, right? It's interesting to me that we are talking about a clock where when we're talking about the clockwise motion of the hands, that is actually a solar rotation, right? When you go the other way, it's actually considered, according to Ganon, a polar rotation. Very, very interesting. So there you go. So on the right hand side, that's a polar sort of cycle. Left hand side, right hand side. I don't know if I messed it up right there, but on the right hand side, solar rotation. On the left hand side, polar rotation. I'm kind of convinced at this point, by the way, I will continually say polar when I mean solar and vice versa for like ever. It's too easy to mess up. But that's fascinating to me. So to me, when I see the clock and just the simple idea of the hands going around the clock, that's also a solar sort of concept, basically. And when you're looking at circumambulation rituals, this is something to keep in mind. If it's rotating this way, that's more of a solar sort of dynamic. When it's going the other way, it's more of a polar dynamic. And also, I'll say that when you're looking at a clockwise motion, I've talked to other people about this. Shout out Topher, that the solar rotation is more expansive. That reminds me of the sun and the rays of the sun. Not even going to get into ray symbolism because it's just too much to get into, like I said earlier. But this is more of an expansive sort of nature. The polar rotation is more of a, what would be the word? So expansive, contractive nature. So even the polar rotation, when you take this into account, it goes back to going towards the center. So the solar rotation away from the center, very interesting, because I think that heliocentrism in large part, this is kind of what it facilitates within people. I think a lot of people in this heliocentric reality that we live in, we give away our energy, right? And we're always looking for external validation, right? You're not really strongly connected to your pole or to your center. But with the polar rotation, considering that it's more contractive in nature, it gets you closer to the center. It gets you closer to your center. Very interesting. So there's a lot of implications here relating to magic and religious rituals and things like that. That's beyond the scope of what I'm talking about here. But I thought this was, at the very least, worth including, right? And so here you see a clock, right? So it's an actual clock. And then it is also a zodiac wheel. And it looks as though this clock has 24 numbers on it, right? So presumably, obviously, it's for the 24-hour cycle that we live in. One of the things I just wanted to point out, though, I think it's kind of interesting that the sun goes around the wheel, but there's another sort of aspect there at the center of that clock, right? And then it looks as though to the upper right of that center, that looks like a moon to me, right? So that center point is a polar sort of dynamic, in my opinion, right? And so I just felt like I needed to point that out, is that even the way a clock works, how a clock functions, is more polar than not, as we will see with sundials. This is a primitive sundial, right? And so look how polar that is. Look how it reminds you of the circumpunct, right? And so the way it works is that you stick a pole or a little rod in the middle there, and then now you have a sundial, right, that you can use to actually tell time. So the nature of the clock itself, I see a polar correspondence there with literally how it functions, right? And then here is another sundial, right? Just that pole going through that disc, and how that pole is going to obviously cast a shadow based on the position of the sun and everything else. So I thought that was worth bringing up. My buddy LC King, shout out Lucas, he's talked about the sundial and the polar aspects of the sundial as well. Off the top of my head, I can't recall exactly his information, but I know he's definitely done videos and presentations or interviews about that as well. It's very, very relevant. I mean, you just look at how a sundial works, and you can see that there's a polar dynamic going on here. So that's the thing I'll say too. Polar symbolism, it's also been referenced as axial symbolism, kind of like the world axis, right? And look how much this looks like a wheel, right? It almost looks like that would be the axle of a wheel. There is a function to axial polar symbolism, right? it's better to describe this tool here from a polar axial perspective than a solar perspective. That the polar aspect predates the solar aspect. I hope that makes sense. Even with the wheel itself, it makes more sense to speak about it from an axial polar perspective than anything else. So just wanted to say that. But we're getting closer to the end here, but there's a few things that I want to share with you before we wrap it up. And hopefully you guys are getting something out of this presentation. Okay, so there's an engraver illustrator. His last name is Westerhovius, Arnaldus Westerhovius. This piece comes from the 18th century. I'm really lucky to have a friend who actually collects these things, and you guys will hear about him at some point. I've talked about him several times, over the last year or so. And we're working together. He's going to make some of these prints available on a site that I'm helping him build. And he has exposed me to some pretty amazing artwork, if I do say so myself. And this is one of them. And if you guys really like this brief decode of this piece, let me know, because I think I don't know how prolific of a artist he is, but my buddy has at least like 3 of his prints, and they're all heavily encoded. And so this piece here, I mean, we could do a whole presentation just on what's going on here. But I want to focus on the zodiac wheel up top. To me, that's more interesting probably than anything else. But the thing is you're going to find, guys, even though it's little discussed or little known, there are authors and illustrators and things like that throughout history who have this polar wisdom. They have this polar understanding of things. They know about the polar or primordial tradition. And I think this guy is one of them. So let's zoom into the top there. So what you see is a zodiac wheel, right? And there's a lot going on. There's lots of gods. You see all 12 signs being represented with this band. But I want to focus on what's happening in the middle, right? So you see this large, what looks like a sun, right, in the middle of the wheel. And I'm inclined to think that this actually may not be a reference to the sun, but is actually a reference to this center sort of idea, right? Which I often, use the pole star as a reference to the center, right? And so I'm not saying that the pole star, that this is literally the pole star, but that the original sort of supreme center correspondence that is attached to the pole star is also attached to what's probably going on here. And I think that when you look at what's happening, it'll make a lot more sense. So as an example, I was talking earlier about Hermes or Mercury being a polar deity. And there you see on the left-hand side, there's a P right next to his head. You see Hermes Mercury, right? And what is he doing? He is pointing his caduceus, which is a wand with serpents wrapped around it, very much an axial world axis symbol. He's pointing at this central light with his wand. Very interesting, because to me, he's indicating that this is the bridge between worlds, right? And he's a psychopomp. He's a conductor of souls. Just above that central light, you also have Saturn there, and he's laying on his side. This makes perfect sense because you can actually see a goat just beneath his legs, and this is Capricorn, right? And so Saturn rules Capricorn, and there you have Saturn right there with his scythe. And it's interesting because it's been said too that Saturn has been known as a central, or excuse me, the original sun. And so I've talked about this on a few other channels. It's something you can look into. This is like a electric universe sort of concept. I'm not saying that this is exactly what I necessarily believe. I just think it's kind of a curious sort of thing, this idea that Saturn was once a sun. And I get into this actually on my, I have a little series, a 2-part series with my fiance, Michelle. And we talked about the lost lore of Saturn, and that's something we kind of get into as well, if you want to hear more about that, basically. And so, what did I say earlier? I said earlier that the winter solstice, right, which begins with Capricorn, that the winter solstice corresponds with the north. This is where you're going to see Santa, right? Santa's going to be coming around the winter solstice. And this is a reference to this solstice corresponding with this polar sort of dynamic. In the Lost Lore of Saturn videos, we talk about Saturn having a polar dynamic as well. It was said that Saturn was the ruler of the last great golden age. And from what I gather, the last great golden age was more of a hyperborean age. It was more of a polar age, basically. And it's been said that the sort of the aspect related to the golden age was that they had an understanding of this center, and that once that was lost, that's when we really entered the dark ages. So the dark ages are emblematic of a lost sacred center, basically, that connects everything, essentially, all of the different realms of reality. But to me, the kicker here is what is right in front of that light there. And for the life of me, literally like 2 or 3 days ago, I tried to find a translation for this word, and it was very difficult. I was going all over the place for it. I couldn't find it. But I recall when I first came across this illustration, I was able to find the translation. And it says Ergamon. Now, that's interesting. To me, it always references primordial. It always references original. This is why Ursa Major and Ursa Minor are called as such. There's a huge relationship with and R as well, which is why we have Arctic, or even like Arthur, King Arthur. There's a northern correspondence with King Arthur and the Knights of the Round Table. There's a whole Arctic, northern polar thing going on with all of that mythology, if you want to look into it. But as of late, I could not find that translation of Ergamon. But I recall it being a wagon, and it looks like a wagon, right? And so it looks like 4 wheels, and it looks like a handle that you would pull the wagon by. Very interesting, because Ursa Major and Ursa Minor have been known as wagons or wains, Odin's wain, right? And so they've been looked at as chariots as well, and plows and things of that sort. So I just think that's a really interesting sort of thing, that it looks like a wagon, it looks like a vehicle, and these northern constellations have been likened or compared to a wagon, or a chariot. And so the fact that there's a wagon right there, I mean, to me, it just seems like it's screaming northern symbolism. And once again, when we're talking about the constellations of the zodiac, they all revolve around one point in the heavens, right? There's no disputing that. That's how it works. And so that one star is the pole star, which is the central star, which is kind of a spiritual star for the center, basically. So I'm not saying that when you look to the pole star that you're looking at the center of the cosmos. I'm saying that the pole star is along the world axis, which is the thread or bridge in the middle of the cosmos, basically. That's what I'm trying to say. Hopefully that makes sense. And if we live in a nested toroidal structure, which I'm inclined to think that we do, it's the same center throughout the whole entire plane of existence, above and below, basically. It's like a world tree system, pretty much. So when you're looking at the North Star, you're looking at like the trunk of a great world tree, essentially, is how I look at it. So one last quote from Henry Corbin before the final slides here. He says, "Northern light, original light, pure inner light, coming neither from the east nor the west. The symbols of the north open spontaneously around that central intuition, which is the intuition of the center." So that's probably better put than how I was trying to explain it. But I love this quote. I think it's fantastic, and I thought it was a really good one to end on. So northern light, original light, pure inner light, coming neither from the east nor the west, not related to the sun. The symbols of the north open spontaneously around that central intuition, which is the intuition of the center. So again, looking at this illustration, if you didn't know any better, you would just be like, duh, that's the sun. There you go, done. Not the case. And in fact, I'm really, really realizing and really appreciating that it is not the case in a lot of older illustrations, and also in a lot of Masonic illustrations. To me, it seems as though part of the sort of shtick is to imply the sun, but you're actually referencing a spiritual sun, or the black sun, the midnight sun, right? So to me, this is an interesting thing too. I feel like it's worth saying that the sun that we all see is the esoteric sun. Everybody has to be mindful of the sun, right? And so whether you, no matter where you live or what you do, you have to acknowledge the rising of the sun, the setting of the sun. And so the exoteric sun, the daily sun, corresponds with daylight. And it's been said that the northern light corresponds with midnight, that the pole star corresponds with midnight. So sometimes this center light is referred to as the midnight sun, but they're not referencing the actual sun. And then finally here, I just want to show you one such example of, if you had no polar symbolism experience under your belt, it'd be a lot harder to decode something like this Masonic tracing board, which I've decoded multiple times at this point. On the left-hand side, you have the sun. On the right-hand side, you have the moon. Well, then where does that stairway go? Where is that stairway going towards? It's going towards the central sun, aka the pole star, aka the north, aka the world axis, right? The midnight sun, black sun, all of these ideas. To me, it's the same sort of thing. I'm really synthesizing all of these things together. Some people may like that, other people may not like that, but it's how I'm perceiving this information, right? And so that is what's going on here, is that generally in Freemasonry, you're going to see two pillars. One pillar is solar, the other pillar is lunar. If there's a central pillar, it's polar. This polar pillar, even polar and pillar, look how similar they are, right? Predates solar symbolism and predates lunar symbolism. I'm really convinced of that now. And I'm really convinced of the idea that there has been this huge switch from polar to solar. There was also a lunar time frame as well. So it would have gone polar tradition, lunar tradition, solar tradition. I think these are all encoded in the three cards of the major arcana, with the star card, polar, the moon card, lunar, and then the sun card, solar. They're all right next to each other. And so we're talking about three different ages, right? I think I've heard someone refer to this as alchemical symbolism. I know this kind of sounds generic because so many things are alchemical, right? But that alchemical symbolism or mythology, you're looking at these works like this, and it's, there's more than meets the eye, essentially. Sometimes these illustrations are actually encoding great ages. And so we are living in the solar age. Notice that the solar pillar is closest to us. And then notice that the pillar associated with the pole star is furthest away, because this is the order of the ages, right? So the oldest primordial age is a polar age, also known as a stellar age. And then after that came the lunar age. And then after that came the solar age, which each of these ages, we're talking about three different ways of looking at time as well, in my opinion, right? So here's just a closer up version of this. You'll see that the stairway is ascending towards a 7-pointed star. That's really significant. The original 7 lights of enlightenment are Ursa Major, right? Which closely revolves around the pole star. 7 stars of Ursa Major, 7 stars of Ursa Minor. I've done a lot of different presentations about that at this point, but hopefully that kind of makes things clear. The other interesting thing that I wanted to note, probably the final thing here, is that stairway is going towards the east, right? So look at the very top, right? You see the E, indicative of east. This is a reference to the mystical east, the mystical orient. This is a reference to the north or beyond the north, the cosmic north, if you want to put it that way. That's what's being encoded here, in my opinion. So hopefully you guys got something out of that. I kind of, in closing with the main part of the presentation here, I really think polar symbolism and polar wisdom is the wisdom of the ages. It's the gift that keeps on giving. So I'm finding more and more information that backs up a lot of these claims. I'm finding more and more authors and more books that make reference to all of this. If you really want to take your symbolism seriously, this has to be understood, in my opinion. If you only have this understanding of the solar paradigm, you're going to be missing out on a lot of crucial information. And so I am just, forever grateful that this rabbit hole kind of fell in my lap in certain ways. And obviously I pursued it in certain ways as well. And so to me, the sun has an origin story. A lot of solar symbolism has an origin, and it's primordial, and it's polar, and it's northern. So there it is. And then also, really what this means then is that the sun is a secondary center, that there was an original center before the sun. And really what we're talking about with these different ages, we're talking about the shift of the center. We're talking about pole shifts, right? Away from the north, away from this sort of central axis, the world axis, towards the sun, which to me, as I've kind of explained, physically doesn't make sense to be a center. Only if you believe in the heliocentric paradigm, which I personally do not. And so if you've let that fall by the wayside and you're more of a geocentrist, or you're more interested in ancient cosmologies, there's even more reason to see that the sun isn't the center. Perhaps the symbolic sun, the spiritual sun, the invisible sun, but not the actual physical sun, even though it is glorious. And even though we have, we have to thank it. We have to thank everything that it gives us, right? So that is not lost on me, by the way. The power of the sun. I've done videos about that. Many people have done videos about that. Many people have written books about that. People have waxed poetic about the power and the brilliance and the radiance of the sun. But this information is lesser known. So that wasn't the point of this conversation. Obviously, the point of it was to talk about this polar solar transfer. All right, guys. Well, thanks for hanging out and watching. If you've made it this far, you're awesome. This concludes my presentation, The Rising Sun, Esoteric Solar Symbolism. There are more sort of threads to pull out here, many, many more. So if this is something you want to see more of, if you think this deserves a part 2, if there's things that I didn't really make that clear, or you just, you want to hear more about it, let me know and we can definitely get that going, because I feel as though I might be inspired to do another one, but we'll see. You never know what happens. And before we get out of here, I do want to mention a couple of things. The first thing is that if you're interested in this topic of northern symbolism, the primordial tradition, everything having to do with the polar to solar switch, I suggest you check out my presentation called The Pleiadians. It'll fill in a lot of gaps for you, and it is well worth your time. Also, I do offer tarot readings and study sessions. You can find more information at symbolicstudies.com, or you can always text me at 503-893-4606. Once again, Symbolic Secrets is my series exclusively for patrons. I just released the 6th episode on the Hierophant. Up until now, I've covered the Fool, the Magician, the High Priestess, the Empress, the Emperor, and then now the Hierophant. I'm currently working on the episode for the Lover's card. This series gives me an excuse to dive deep and share my latest research about each card. So if you're interested, you should sign up at patreon.com/symbolicstudies or symbolicstudies.com. In case you're unaware, I've been a graphic designer for 25 years, and I've designed everything under the sun, from logos to websites, brochures, t-shirts, album covers. I've done skate decks and things like that. If you run a business and you're in need of design services, or you're in need of an art director, please reach out and request a portfolio, and I'll send you my work. I'd love to know what you're working on and see if we're a good fit. And that concludes this presentation. I'll see you guys soon.